You're standing on a beach somewhere in Southeast Asia, roughly 65,000 years ago. There is no map, there is no compass, there is no boat with a name and a keel and a hull built by anyone who went to school for it. There is just open water in front of you, stretching out further than you can see, and somewhere out there, invisible from where you're standing, is an entire continent nobody in your family has ever set foot on. No GPS, no weather forecast, no emergency rescue if it goes wrong. And at some point, a group of humans looked at that horizon and got in a boat anyway. That's not a metaphor. That actually happened. Humans reached Australia by open ocean crossing at least 65,000 years ago, according to archaeological evidence from a site called Majedbi in the Northern Territory. And Australia has never, at any point in its geological history since humans existed, been connected to mainland Asia by a land bridge you could simply walk across. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, there was still a minimum of roughly 90 kilometers of open water between the edge of the Asian continental shelf and the edge of the landmass that includes Australia and New Guinea. 90 kilometers of ocean crossed by people with no metal tools, no written language, and by every archaeological indication, no prior experience anyone could have taught them, because nobody had ever done it before. So here's the actual question worth spending 20 minutes on. How did people with what looks on paper like almost nothing spread across virtually the entire habitable planet, reaching nearly every continent, climate, and ecosystem on Earth, tens of thousands of years before anyone had invented the wheel? And the answer, once you actually dig into it, makes the achievement look even more insane than the no GPS framing already suggests. Let's start with the actual scale of what we're talking about, because the numbers here are genuinely hard to hold in your head properly. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. By around 70,000 years ago, groups of humans had begun moving out of Africa in what researchers call the Out of Africa dispersal. And from that starting point, humans reached the Middle East, then South Asia, then Southeast Asia, then Australia, then Europe, then Siberia, then across the Bering Land Bridge, into the Americas, then all the way down to the southern tip of South America. A place called Monteverde in Chile with confirmed human habitation by at least 14,500 years ago, and quite possibly earlier. From one small population in East Africa to literally the opposite end of the planet through deserts, through ice ages, through open ocean, across every kind of terrain the Earth has to offer, in roughly 55,000 years. Which sounds like an enormous stretch of time until you remember these were people walking, mostly on foot generation after generation, with no possible way of knowing there was anything at all on the other side of whatever they were currently crossing. Here's the first thing that made this possible, and it's not a piece of technology at all. It's a psychological trait, and it might be the single most important adaptation in this entire story. Humans appear to have an unusually strong and unusually specific drive toward exploration itself, not just resource-seeking behavior when local food runs out, but a genuine pull toward the unknown that shows up even when the immediate practical payoff isn't obvious. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer populations, including work by anthropologist Kim Hill on groups like the Ache of Paraguay, have documented this directly, describing young men in particular regularly undertaking exploratory journeys into unfamiliar territory that carry real risk and no guaranteed benefit, simply to learn what's out there. Information that then gets folded back into the group's collective knowledge, even when the explorer personally gained nothing tangible from the trip. Some researchers have proposed this drive is tied to a genetic variant of the DRD4 dopamine receptor gene, sometimes nicknamed the wanderlust gene in popular science writing, which shows up at meaningfully higher frequencies in populations with longer migration histories. That's a correlation, not a proven causal mechanism, and it's important to be honest about that limitation. But the behavioral pattern itself, humans consistently pushing into unknown territory well beyond what immediate survival strictly requires, is one of the most well-documented and consistent traits across the entire archaeological and ethnographic record of our species. Now let's talk about the actual physical technology, because contrary to the "they had nothing" framing that makes for a punchier opening, ancient humans were nowhere near as under-equipped as popular imagination tends to assume. Let's start with the ocean crossing to Australia, because it's genuinely one of the most impressive engineering achievements in all of prehistory, even though it left behind almost no direct physical evidence. Wooden watercraft don't survive 65,000 years in the archaeological record. Wood rots. But researchers have reconstructed likely methods through several independent lines of evidence. Experimental archaeology, actually building replica bamboo rafts and testing them on real ocean crossings, has demonstrated that a simple lashed bamboo raft using tools and materials available to humans at that time, stone tools for cutting and shaping, plant fiber for lashings, could realistically survive a multi-day open ocean crossing given the right currents and enough people paddling in coordination. Researcher Robert Bednarik conducted exactly this kind of experimental voyage in the 1990s, successfully crossing significant stretches of open water, using only technology that would have been available in the Paleolithic. It wasn't fast. It wasn't safe by any modern standard. But it worked, which tells you the 90-kilometer crossing to Australia, while extraordinarily risky, was not physically impossible for people with basic raft-building knowledge, sufficient nerve, and almost certainly more than one failed attempt that simply never made it into any historical record because nobody survived to tell anyone about it. Let's talk about navigation, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncanny and where a lot of what ancient humans were doing starts to look less like blind luck and more like sophisticated, systematic observation passed down across generations. Without instruments, ancient seafaring and long-distance overland populations relied on an extraordinarily detailed working knowledge of natural signals that modern people have almost entirely lost the ability to read. Wave patterns, for instance. Pacific Islander navigators whose oral traditions and practical seafaring techniques have been extensively documented by anthropologists and preserved in some living traditions today, learned to read subtle patterns in ocean swells that indicated the presence of unseen islands far over the horizon, swells that reflected or refracted off distant landmasses in specific learnable, teachable patterns. Cloud formations behave differently over open ocean versus near land, often forming distinctive stationary cloud banks above islands due to temperature and humidity differences, a visible signal from many kilometers further away than the island itself would ever be visible. Bird flight patterns provided another layer of information entirely, since certain seabird species reliably return to land at specific times of day, meaning their flight direction at dawn or dusk functioned as a kind of living compass pointing toward the nearest shore. None of this was written down, obviously, because writing didn't exist yet. It was observed, tested, refined, and transmitted person to person, generation to generation, through exactly the kind of oral knowledge transfer we've discussed on this channel before. The same mechanism that carried forward everything from fire-making to plant medicine to social punishment system. An entire sophisticated body of applied science that left behind no artifacts at all because its entire storage medium was human memory. Overland, the picture looks similar in its underlying logic, even though the specific skills were different. Ancient humans expanding across entirely new continents were essentially running a continuous, multi-generational scientific survey of unfamiliar landscapes, tracking which plants were edible through trial and often fatal error, which water sources were reliable across different seasons, which animal migration patterns could be predicted and intercepted, which mountain passes were survivable at which times of year. Genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that human expansion into new territories often followed coastlines and river systems. Specifically, not because humans lacked the physical capability to cross interior terrain, but because coastlines and rivers provided the most reliable, most information-dense environment for a population expanding into completely unknown country. Predictable fresh water. Predictable food sources, including fish and shellfish that don't require the kind of specialized big-game hunting knowledge a totally new landscape might not yet support. And a natural continuous geographic guide that made getting catastrophically lost considerably less likely than striking out blind across unfamiliar interior terrain. Here's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people because it cuts against the primitive humans stumbling forward by accident image that's honestly still pretty common in casual thinking about this era. The archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly suggests these movements were not random, undirected wandering. Population genetics research tracking mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome markers across modern populations worldwide has allowed researchers to reconstruct migration routes with a level of detail that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. And what that data increasingly shows is a pattern of directed, sequential expansion, groups pushing into new territory, establishing themselves, and then subsequent generations pushing further outward from that new base, repeating the process over dozens of generations. This is systematic colonization behavior, not aimless drift. Whether every individual group explicitly understood themselves to be part of some larger multi-generational project of colonizing a continent is obviously unknowable and almost certainly the wrong way to think about it. But the aggregate pattern viewed across tens of thousands of years looks remarkably deliberate. Now here's the part of this story that deserves genuine unqualified awe, because it's easy to talk about migration in the abstract and lose track of what individual journeys actually required. The colonization of the Americas is probably the single best example. Current genetic and archaeological evidence suggests humans crossed from Siberia into North America via the Bering Land Bridge, a strip of exposed land connecting the two continents during the last ice age when sea levels were dramatically lower, sometime before around 15,000 years ago, with some evidence suggesting considerably earlier dates that remain actively debated among archaeologists. From that entry point in what's now Alaska, human populations spread the entire length of two continents, through Arctic tundra, through temperate forest, through desert, through tropical rainforest, through the Andes at altitudes that cause altitude sickness in modern people who fly in without acclimatizing, all the way to Monte Verde in southern Chile. A journey of roughly 15,000 kilometers in a straight line, considerably longer accounting for the actual terrain, achieved entirely on foot across every climate zone that exists on the planet, in what geologically speaking amounts to the blink of an eye. Think about what that actually required at a biological and cultural level, not just a geographic one. Every different climate zone demanded genuinely different survival knowledge. Arctic environments required entirely different clothing technology, different food sources, different shelter techniques than tropical rainforest a few thousand kilometers south. A population moving through that range of environments within a handful of generations had to be capable of rapidly acquiring, testing, and transmitting completely new bodies of practical knowledge fast enough to keep the group alive at every single stage with zero margin for a multi-generational trial and error period. Because getting it wrong in an unfamiliar Arctic winter doesn't give you a second attempt. So let's pull this all together, because the honest answer to how ancient humans traveled so far is not any single clever trick or technology. It's a compounding effect of several things happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other across tens of thousands of years. A genuine psychological drive toward exploration that pushed people toward unknown horizons, even without a guaranteed payoff. Genuinely sophisticated, if informally transmitted, navigational science built entirely on close observation of natural signals, refined and tested, and passed down with a level of accuracy modern people, without that specific training, simply can't replicate. Practical watercraft and overland technology that, while primitive by modern standards, was considerably more capable than popular imagination usually credits it for. And an underlying pattern of systematic sequential colonization group by group, generation by generation. That looks in retrospect less like blind wandering and more like the largest, unplanned, uncoordinated, and almost entirely successful expansion project any species has ever undertaken. There is something worth sitting with here. The next time you're on a plane watching hours of ocean scroll by beneath you in complete comfort and complete safety, or driving across a stretch of desert highway with air conditioning and a full tank of gas and a phone in your pocket that can tell you exactly where you are down to a few meters at any moment. Every single mile of that same ground, every single stretch of that same ocean was already crossed thousands of years before any of that technology existed, by people who had absolutely no way of knowing what they'd find on the other side, and who did it anyway. You're not just descended from people who survived, you're descended, specifically, from the ones who kept walking toward the horizon they couldn't see past.